Another one that we dealt with was, again, I can name the applicant. In this case, generally we don't name applicants because we respect their privacy. In this particular case, the applicant, Eamon Murphy, chose to waive his right of anonymity, so we have named him with his consent, both on the website and in our annual report. Now, it was a case where there was a land transaction between the IDA and the applicant's late aunt and uncle. There was disputes over whether or not the transaction was properly carried out, as to whether or not the same parcel of land was exchanged as was meant to be exchanged, and so on. After a long process of correspondence between the parties, the IDA commissioned a report into the matter, and the applicant sought access to that report. Really what was involved was that there was a former regional manager in the IDA who had overall responsibility for that transaction, and he objected very strongly to any release of any input he might have had into that process. So we looked at it and we found that that person, although now retired and at the time of our decision was retired, had at the time of creation of the record been acting in his official capacity. So where an official of a public body acts in their official capacity, that information specifically is not personal to that official under FOI. So we found that the information wasn't personal and we found for release. So that's just a quick tour of some of our key provisions, how the Act works, what we do, and some of our key decisions. And obviously, when the other contributors have finished, I'll be happy to take any questions any might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. We kind of have a poacher and gamekeeper relationship at the top table here. So before we hear from the other side of the fence, no, we'll let that come out of the wash. Can I just check that down the back? People can hear our panelists over the top. Okay. If not, just give me a nod or give me an indication. So, Gavin, if you'd like to introduce and share with us some of your stories.
I'm on the other side of the fence to Sean. So I'm sending a lot of FOIs. So myself and a friend of mine set up a website last year. It's just over a year old, with the intention of, instead of kind of sending one FOI every so often to see what information you could get out of it. I'm a journalist as well, by the way, but we took a view that we would instead send a lot of FOIs. Sometimes similar, sometimes not, but really with the idea that instead of fishing for stories and then writing stories and then kind of forgetting about the documents themselves, we took a view that we would publish all the documents and publish all the data that we get from all departments and all public bodies from whom we ask for information. So over the past 12 months, we've sent about 100 FOIs. We've got several appeals in with the Information Commissioner, both under this Act and under another piece of legislation, the Access to Information on the Environment, which I won't confuse everybody with, but it's a similar piece of legislation, but more restricted to environmental information. It's interesting being on either side of the fence to Sean, because we interface constantly with public bodies to get information. So we send requests very regularly to get information. And it's an expensive process depending on which department I think you're dealing with. But I think we've found that over the past 12 months in seeking information, we've seen a lot of different ways that different bodies will apply the exemptions that Sean was talking about. So we would send maybe very similar requests to multiple public bodies. They would end up citing different exemptions or more exemptions than other bodies for similar information, and we find that there's very little consistency, I suppose, between departments, or there can be very little consistency when you're looking for information. Over the past 12 months, we've asked for digital copies of everything that we seek because we publish it online. Invariably, we're given hard copies, so we have to scan everything, which involves scanning. I think I was counting it up in my head last week. I don't know, 20,000 pages over the past 12 months, and we also on a technical level we also OCR everything. So everything that we publish, we scan, and then we make it searchable. So they're not just images. When people Google stuff, they will find whatever's in the document as well. So sometimes what we'll do is because it's 15 euros, as Sean was saying, we will take a view that we have to maximize the potential of the 15 euros. Instead of seeking one particular piece of information from a public body, we'll seek as much as we possibly can under that 15 euros, because when you do a lot of requests, 15 euros becomes quite a lot. So what we'll do is we'll do what we might call a template FOI. So we'll say, I will look for a minister's diary from the department, plus the log of FOI requests, plus the FOI requests of other people who've got information from the same department, and then we'll look for what we're actually after. So we'll try and maximise how you get information out of the department, partly because we might be looking for something particular, but also because the information that we're looking for, we believe should be in the public domain anyway, that we really shouldn't have to ask for a lot of the stuff that we're getting. Things like ministers' diaries, we just think, why is the minister's diary on a computer in the department and not on the department's website? How come I don't have a right to know what ministers are doing on my behalf all over the world or in Ireland, who they're meeting, why they're meeting them? Just this basic information that we think should be in the public domain. So we spent the last 12 months FOIing a lot of departments for all the diaries, for all the ministers and the Taoiseach for the past 12 years, all their diaries and all the information about who they're meeting. And it's interesting, the process you go through is varies from department to department. Some departments will just give it to you without any redactions, without any exemptions applied. Some departments will give you the same information, but they'll take some stuff out. Some departments will say that'll be €100 search and retrieval, and we'll say, well, why? And they'll say that's the situation. And you can appeal the fees, strangely, but you have to pay to appeal on the fees. And that's really down to the 2003 amendment. But I think what we've learned in 12 months of doing this is that there's some really, really good people out there in departments, and there's some really people who are, and there's some people out there who really support what we do in terms of trying to bring more sunlight onto the public sector. And we're not anti-public sector, it's important to say that. We're kind of more pro-transparency about the processes and how public money is spent, what civil servants do with their time, how ministers spend our money. And in a way, we don't really think there should be an FOI act. And that might sound funny in an FOI forum, but a lot of this information should just be public, and it should be published not a year later. Like, we get a Controller and Auditor General report every year. Why do we have to? Why isn't all of this just published proactively? So if there was no FOI act, we would be probably in a much better position in the sense that departments would take a proactive stance and say, right, anything that isn't commercially sensitive or anything that isn't of a certain sensitive nature, then we'll just publish everything in a structured, organised, readable, machine-readable way, that databases are published, diaries are published. And it's worth remembering as well that since about 2004, 2005, most public bodies in Ireland record things electronically. And yet we still are confronted with a situation where when I ask for information in electronic format, I'm given it on paper. And I have to go through the process again of scanning it and publishing it online. And I think that's a big problem, because I spend a lot of time talking to Sean, and I spend a lot of time appealing very lengthy appeal processes, not just to get information that I'm interested in, but also to try and create some sense that this should be replicated in other public bodies. So if I the one last year for the expenses database of the Department of Arts, Sport and Tourism, and it was a 4 or 5 month process to get that information. It was eventually released through a settlement, but not through a decision of the Information Commissioner. But as a result of the settlement and the understanding that, you know, this wasn't voluminous, it wasn't a big request, there was no personal information as such, that request could be then replicated to other departments. So I sent the same request to 6 or 7 other departments. And just this week I got the expenses database for the HSE, which is a significant amount of data to try and understand. But it's, in a way, one of the problems that I see all the time is, especially when it comes to data that's held by departments and databases, is the lack of context. So what I'll do is I'm looking at the data and I'm saying, okay, here's 28,000 expense claims by 15,000 civil servants with each expense claim and each amount. And there'll be no context. I won't know what they were working at, or I won't know how the money was spent, or I won't know the rationale. And I want to know that because I want to be fair to the vast majority of people who are just going about their jobs and are claiming expenses legitimately and going through the process. But I also believe that the process of publication of expenses, in particular, will lead to a greater culture of transparency and accountability, because when you publish stuff online and it's open to public scrutiny by default, there's less likelihood, if fraud or if unjustified expense claims were to happen. If John O'Donoghue's expense claims have been published proactively for the last 5 years, would he have gone down the road of claiming so much expenses? I don't think he would. I think if it was open to public scrutiny by default, why would we have any of these? We wouldn't have had any of these scandals because people would have just known. Or else he wouldn't have claimed the expenses because he would have known they would have been in the public domain. And I think really, when it comes to FOI, I'm trying to push to the maximum level that you can in terms of getting as much information as possible through the Act, legitimately, publishing it online, sharing it with the public, and then seeing if that encourages, and this could take a decade, it could take years, it could take a cultural shift within the civil service as well. But I believe that if you start the process, then it's to the benefit of everybody that everything is open to greater public scrutiny. And on the coalface, when you're sending requests and you're dealing with multiple requests with multiple civil servants, with multiple FOI officers who vary in personality, which is fine, and some people you get on really well with, some not so much. But I think it's creating a false barrier between the information that's on the other side of the FOI officer is like, well, that's kind of my information, and you're a proxy to get it. Why is there this barrier to release? This constant barrier that somehow it's a threat, or it's an implied threat that I'm seeking this information, and there's a kind of an inherent defensiveness within the public sector, and you're like, well, I'm not really attacking you. What I'm trying to say is that this information should just be public. And some departments are more defensive than others. I think it's a fascinating process. It's something that I really enjoy doing, although people think I'm crazy for thinking that. But I think in the long run, it's really a long-term thing. This incidental information that I get is just published. And to somebody at some point, this information might be valuable. So if I get the Taoiseach's diary from 2004, it was never in the public domain before. It was released, but it wasn't online, and I scan it and put it online. Somebody might want to see when the Taoiseach was doing something on a certain day. At some point in the future, I don't know. Maybe it will have no benefit to anybody. But I believe that having the document there as a reference is critical. And the same applies not just to freedom of information since 1998, but it applies to all public documents since the history, in the history of the state. If you try to get the Beef Tribunal report online, it's not online. It's one of the most important tribunal reports. The same applies to the Ansbach report. I had to put it online because it wasn't online. The Gavin report in the mid-90s, that's not online. The Whiddy Island Tribunal report, that's not online. Ireland has a great history of writing reports and putting them on a shelf and then saying we've done something about it, but nothing actually happens. I believe that if you free the data, free the information, then that creates, I think it's the famous quote, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And the more information, and the internet is such a beautiful mechanism because it's so cheap to publish information. It's actually free. You can publish vast amounts of information about how the government operates online. And if more people did, I'd love not to be one of the only people in Ireland doing this. I think everybody should have some particular interest. If they want to get information, if they want to know how to do it, I'd love to help anybody who wants to get information and to share it with the greater public as well. So I'm actually more interested in the questions than I am with me talking about. So I'll finish there.
Thank you, Gavin. While the internet may be free, I think Gavin's time is not free, so I'm curious to know how many hours you're going to spend scanning the HSE expenses.
Oh no, they're already in a database, I just have to publish them.
Okay.